As we look back on the birth of a nation, there is one man who stands out as the father of modern America. George Washington, a notable soldier, statesman, and leader, was a remarkable figure whose influence on history can still be observed in present times. Growing up in Virginia, a British colony at the time, Washington could not have foreseen that he would one day lead a victorious military revolt to gain independence from Britain and establish the United States of America. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, at his family's estate on Pope's Creek in the British colony of Virginia. His parents were Augustine Washington and Mary Ball Washington, and he was the oldest of their 6 children. George Washington's father, who had 4 children from his previous marriage to Jane Butler, was a well-known public figure and a justice of the peace. During his early years, he lived mostly at Ferry Farm, which was a plantation situated close to Fredericksburg, Virginia. When George was only 11 years old, his father passed away, and he is believed to have assisted his mother in managing the plantation. Washington did not receive a formal education like his older brothers who attended Appleby Grammar School in England. However, he did attend the lower church school in Hartfield where he learned mathematics, trigonometry, and land surveying. As a result, he developed an impressive skill set in drawing and map-making. When Washington was a teenager, he displayed a talent for mathematics and subsequently achieved success as a surveyor. By conducting surveying expeditions into the undeveloped areas of Virginia, he earned sufficient funds to start purchasing land for himself. In 1751, George Washington embarked on his sole journey outside of the United States when he accompanied his older half-brother Lawrence Washington to Barbados. Lawrence was suffering from tuberculosis and had hoped that the warm climate would aid in his recovery. Unfortunately, soon after their arrival, George contracted smallpox. Although he survived, the disease left permanent scars on his face. In 1752, Lawrence, who had been educated in England and acted as George's mentor, passed away. Subsequently, George inherited Mount Vernon, Lawrence's estate, located along the Potomac River near Alexandria, Virginia. In December of 1752, George Washington was appointed commander of the Virginia militia, despite having no prior military experience. During the French and Indian War, he actively participated in military operations and eventually became responsible for leading all of Virginia's militia forces. After resigning from his post in 1759, Washington returned to Mount Vernon and was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he remained until 1774. In January of the same year, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children. Despite not having any biological children of their own, Washington became a loving stepfather to Martha's children, and the couple remained devoted to each other throughout their lives. Over time, Washington increased the size of his Mount Vernon estate from 2,000 acres to 8,000 acres and established 5 different farms on the property. He cultivated various crops such as wheat and corn, raised mules, and managed orchards for fruit production along with a thriving fishery. Washington had a great passion for farming and constantly explored new crops and land conservation techniques through experimentation. Washington's proficiency was more as a general rather than a military strategist, as he excelled in keeping the struggling colonial army united, rather than solely relying on his tactical genius. His troops were ill-equipped and undernourished, with shortages of basic necessities such as ammunition and shoes during winter. Nevertheless, Washington's direction and motivation were instrumental in keeping the soldiers going. The Valley Forge winter of 1777 to 1778 showcased his leadership prowess, as he inspired his men to persevere through trying circumstances. In the late 1760s, Washington personally witnessed the impact of increased taxes enforced upon American colonists by the British. As a result, he became convinced that it was beneficial for the colonists to break away from England and declare independence. Washington attended the First Continental Congress in 1774 as a representative. The Second Continental Congress met a year later, marking the official commencement of the American Revolution. Subsequently, Washington was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Throughout the long and difficult 8 years of war, the American colonial forces found victory in only a handful of battles. Despite this, they consistently maintained their position against the British Army. In October 1781, with support from the French who had allied themselves with the colonists rather than the British, the Continental forces successfully seized General Charles Cornwallis and his troops in the Battle of Yorktown. This triumph marked the end of the Revolutionary War and cemented Washington's status as a revered national hero. Following the signing of the Treaty of Paris between Great Britain and the U.S. in 1783, Washington felt that his duties had been fulfilled and relinquished his command of the army to return to Mount Vernon. He intended to resume his life as a farmer and focus on his family. However, in 1787, he received an invitation to attend the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia and lead the committee tasked with drafting the new Constitution. His exceptional leadership during the convention impressed the delegates, who recognized him as the most suitable candidate for the role of the first president of the nation. Washington initially hesitated when offered the opportunity to become the first president of the new nation. He wished to return home and leave governance to others. Despite this, overwhelming public opinion eventually convinced him to accept the role. In the first presidential election held on January 7, 1789, Washington emerged victorious with a significant lead over his competitors. John Adams became the nation's first vice president after receiving the second largest number of votes. At 57 years old, Washington was inaugurated on April 30, 1789, in New York City.
The Constitution of the United States!
The Constitution of the United States. So help me, God.
God bless George Washington, President of the United States!
As the future capital city of America, Washington, D.C. was yet to be built at this time, so he resided in New York and Philadelphia. During his tenure as president, he signed a bill establishing a permanent U.S. capital city along the Potomac River, which would later be named Washington, D.C. in his honor. When Washington became president, the United States was a relatively small nation comprising of 11 states and an estimated 4 million people. As there were no established precedents for how a new president should conduct both domestic and foreign affairs, Washington recognized that his actions would serve as a basis for future presidencies. Therefore, he worked diligently to set an example of fairness, prudence, and integrity. In matters concerning foreign affairs, he prioritized maintaining amicable relations with other countries while advocating for neutrality in international conflicts. On a domestic front, he appointed John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, signed legislation establishing the Bank of the United States, and formed his own presidential cabinet. Washington appointed two notable figures to his cabinet, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who held contrasting views on the role of the federal government. Hamilton was a supporter of a powerful central government and part of the Federalist Party. Meanwhile, Jefferson favored the strengthening of states' rights under the Democratic-Republican Party, which later evolved into the Democratic Party. Despite these opposing perspectives, Washington recognized the importance of diverse opinions for the success of the new government. However, he was troubled by what he perceived as an emerging trend towards partisanship. During George Washington's presidency, several historic events took place. For instance, he authorized the signing of the very first copyright law in the United States to safeguard the intellectual property rights of authors. Additionally, he issued the first Thanksgiving proclamation, declaring November 26th as a national day of thanks and recognition of the end of the American Independence War and the successful ratification of the Constitution. While George Washington served as president, the United States Congress implemented the first federal revenue law that imposed a tax on distilled spirits. This new tax prompted an uprising among farmers in western Pennsylvania in July 1794, known as the Whiskey Rebellion. To quell the rebellion and demonstrate the authority of the national government, Washington summoned over 12,000 militiamen to Pennsylvania. This event presented one of the earliest significant challenges to the supremacy of the federal government. During Washington's presidency, the Bill of Rights was ratified and the Union welcomed 5 new states: North Carolina in 1789, Rhode Island in 1790, Vermont in 1791, Kentucky in 1792, and Tennessee in 1796. During his second term, Washington sought to maintain the nation's neutrality when Great Britain and France went to war in 1793. However, French Minister Edmond Charles Genet, also known as Citizen Genet, openly defied Washington's proclamation of neutrality during his tour of the United States. He tried to establish French military bases and garner support for his cause in the western United States, causing controversy between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. This widened the divide between the two parties and made it more challenging to reach a consensus. During Washington's presidency, his administration signed 3 significant international treaties. The first was Jay's Treaty in 1795, negotiated by John Jay with the government of King George III, which helped to avoid war between the U.S. and Great Britain. However, some members of Congress were unhappy with its terms, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison fiercely opposed it. The French also believed that it contravened previous agreements between France and the United States. The Second Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty, also known as the Treaty of San Lorenzo, was signed in 1795 and established positive relations between the U.S. and Spain. It defined borders between the U.S. and Spanish territories in North America and opened up the Mississippi River to American traders. The third treaty was the Treaty of Tripoli, signed in the following year, which allowed American ships to access Mediterranean shipping lanes in exchange for an annual tribute paid to the Pasha of Tripoli. After serving 2 terms as president, George Washington retired in 1796 and urged the nation to uphold high domestic standards while minimizing involvement with foreign powers in his farewell address. To this day, the address is commemorated each February in the U.S. Senate on Washington's birthday. Upon returning to Mount Vernon, Washington worked to restore the productivity of his plantation after over 4 decades of public service had aged him. Despite this, he remained a commanding figure. However, in December 1799, he caught a cold inspecting his properties in the rain, which developed into a throat infection and ultimately caused his death on December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. He was buried at Mount Vernon, which was later designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1960. George Washington left behind an enduring legacy as the father of his country. His image appears on both the US dollar bill and quarter, and numerous schools, towns, counties, as well as the state of Washington and the nation's capital city, were named in his honor.